I'm Marcia Nedland. I'm one of the organizers for the National Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice, and we will be talking briefly about what that means. But today, our webinar is the third in a series of four with who I'm now calling an international thought leader, Alan Mallach. He truly is. It just occurred to me a couple of webinars ago that he is, because he's traveling around the world talking about, issues that are absolutely omnipresent here in the United States, but also affect cities around the world. Today, our topic is vacancy and reuse of commercial properties, understanding those markets, what the challenges are, and what opportunities are available to us to deal with both the real estate involved and also the absence of the market niche or the market fill that those businesses used to represent. So it's a common problem in middle neighborhoods. It is often the most visible part of our middle neighborhoods and something that many of our middle neighborhood community practice members work on. So as always, we have my colleague Anne behind the scenes doing slides. So let me tell you a couple of things about the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative. It is a national initiative focused on mobilizing attention to middle neighborhoods because they are disappearing, either through decline or gentrification. The reasons for that are myriad. The initiative brings attention to this situation through its community practice. This is one of the things that we do, our regular webinar series, and we have, I don't know, I think it's something over 4,000 members now of practitioners, policymakers, and researchers. We do have a research function. Alan has been a big part of that in the past, particularly working on research about Black middle neighborhoods and how their path has been different than their white counterparts. We do policy analysis through NCST, and communication strategies are also largely managed by NCST. This initiative is coordinated, shared by National Community Stabilization Trust and NeighborWorks America. So NeighborWorks America supports the community of practice. NCST handles our national steering committee. We have a couple of members of our steering committee on this webinar right now. And they also handle all of the policy work. So let's go and see what is a middle neighborhood. I'm only going to tell you one slide's worth about that. A lot of you already know. So we are usually talking about places that have mostly, they were built with single family homes meant for families with children, which is what the big demographic was at the time they were built. They tend to be still well more than 50% owner occupied, but that's been eroding. Many of them probably had 90% owner occupancy when they were built. Their housing stock is aging. It's in generally acceptable condition, so it's usually not the biggest priority of, anyone who's managing code enforcement, but it does have some fatal flaws, which is that it tends to lack the features and updates that would allow it to compete well for today's home buyers unless the market is very strong. One of the things I love about middle neighborhoods is that they tend to be more racially, ethnically, and economically diverse than either their higher income or lower income counterparts. So they really are those mixed income, mixed ethnicity, mixed race neighborhoods that many of us love about cities and try to or aspire to when we're revitalizing more troubled neighborhoods. Today, we have Alan with us again. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Community Progress. There's their website. They're a wonderful partner to us. And I think maybe at least twice in this presentation, I will talk about their upcoming Vacant Properties Conference. But as I said, Alan Mallach gets around the world talking about these issues. He's written, I think we decided 14 books, not counting their reprints in other languages, on topics ranging from opera to community development to upcoming issues around population decline. So here we go. We want to definitely promote CCP's upcoming conference. I believe it's an every other year event, Reclaiming Vacant Properties 26. I've been to several of these. It's an astounding event with peers doing workshops for peers. It has a sense of community that is beyond many other scenarios I've seen. It's very informative. It's always very current and completely grounded in real world experience of everyone who's doing presentations. So registration is open and I encourage you to go take a look. So today we're going to do, I'm about to hand off to Alan so he can do a presentation, which will involve some discussion, but most of our audience Q&A will be toward the end, and we'll have plenty of time for that. We will be sending around the slide deck to anyone who registered for this event, so you needn't worry about that. And I think maybe that means it's time to introduce you, Alan, and have him switch over and take on his slide deck. You're also muted, FYI. Welcome, and thank you so much for giving your time to us again.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marcia. And I'll just reiterate what Marcia just said about the RVP conference. By the way, it's every 18 months. I'm not sure
Oh, is it?
exactly why they did that, but so in alternate years, it'll be in the
Okay.
spring, fall, and so forth. And it is, again, a remarkable event in terms of the real substance of what the programs are about, and in the remarkable opportunity to just connect with and network just with roughly 1,000 people who are all working on similar issues and challenges in their communities around the country. So I recommend it very highly to anybody who's concerned about this stuff. Now, today, though, I'm going to talk about vacancy and reuse of commercial properties. And there are a lot of different kinds of commercial properties. So, for example, they fall into, I've put them here into basically 5 boxes, one of which is neighborhood commercial properties, the commercial corridors that serve the neighborhoods, including, and in fact, particularly middle neighborhoods. But in addition, there are 4 others which we should be aware of. One, of course, is the downtown commercial properties, the office buildings, and the commercial and mixed use buildings that support them. A second kind, which is probably, in terms of sheer numbers, the largest single category, is car-oriented facilities, starting from the little strip shopping centers that emerged on highways after World War II to the humongous regional malls that exist now in far more numbers than the American economy is willing to support them, which I'll get to a little bit later. Then you also have brownfields or industrial properties and institutional buildings, either their present use or their potential future use, because a lot of those things are changing over time. But today, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the neighborhood commercial market, which is what's directly relevant to middle neighborhoods as well as other urban and to some extent suburban and small town markets as well. So that'll be the main focus. But if anyone has specific questions about some of the other forms of commercial properties, by all means, put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll do my best to try to get to them as well when we get to the audience participation part of the program. So without further ado, one central question: why does this matter so much, especially in middle neighborhoods? And I think there are a couple of answers to that. And one, which people may think is an answer, but really is not so much of an answer. So the first answer I suspect a lot of people may think about is, well, it's important that people have a place to go to buy the stuff they need, whether it's food, shoes, clothing, you know, smartphones, whatever. Actually, the interesting thing and the sad thing is that one of the main reasons that neighborhood commercial corridors have declined to such an extent, including in middle neighborhoods where people are not poor and have a fair amount of disposable income, is because people don't necessarily need to, to go there to get their stuff. And in fact, with cars, you can go almost anywhere. And so that becomes a big issue. The second point is that even if it isn't the place where most people in the neighborhood go to get the things they want to buy or find the services they need, it is still physically and I would say conceptually the heart of the neighborhood. These neighborhoods, for the most part, were built with these neighborhood corridors as kind of like there's the neighborhood spine, and with the ribs sort of going off them with the residential streets and the other facilities. And historically, they were pretty much the heart of the neighborhood. And when they stop functioning as the heart of the neighborhood, that hurts the entire neighborhood. Not only does it mean that the neighborhood lacks a center, it also affects people who might want to live in the neighborhood, might want to buy a house in the neighborhood. If you come down the spine, and typically the way you get to these neighborhoods is by coming in on the commercial street and then going off on a residential street, and you see vacant boarded up storefronts, trash, vacant lots, et cetera, you start to say, is this a neighborhood I want to put my money and my life into? So so it's a really critically important part of the neighborhood, independent of its significance as a place to buy things and get services. And that I think is really important to remember. And when you start thinking about what to do in the way of strategies for the neighborhood, that becomes a really important consideration. So, stepping back though, I'm going to talk a little bit about some general considerations about commercial properties. Okay, the first thing is commercial and residential markets work very differently. And it's important to understand that because a lot of people might try, who are familiar with residential markets and residential development, might try to draw inferences from residential markets which don't necessarily apply. And this, I think, is an interesting chart. You have three cities on the left that are struggling economically and have large numbers of housing vacancies. Three cities on the right, DC, Seattle, and Denver, that are booming economically, have virtually no housing vacancies. And when you look at their commercial vacancy rates, they're not that different. In fact, Denver has about the same vacancy rate in commercial properties as Buffalo. So the question, why? How could it be that commercial vacancies are about the same in a booming, thriving city as in a struggling city which is losing population? Well, the short answer is commercial markets are non-fungible. Okay, what does that mean? It has nothing to do with mushrooms. The non-fungible basically means with housing, basically, now it's obvious, houses are not completely interchangeable. A McMansion is not the same as a studio apartment and so forth. But to a very large extent, people can adapt themselves to a wide variety of housing types based on what's available, what they can afford, what. So pretty much all housing in a given market area is a market. If you can't afford a house, you might find a garden apartment. If you can't, and so forth. Commercial is completely different. People who go into the commercial market are looking for a specific type of property. If they can't find that property, they don't open the business. So, in other, if you're trying to open a restaurant and you can't find a storefront in the location where you think your restaurant should go, you won't open the business. You're not going to open that business in a fourth floor office suite because it happens to be available. So the upshot is that at any given point in a market, certain types of commercial properties are in demand and certain are not. And as people come into the market, so for example, in downtowns, there are Class A offices, which are the shiny new buildings with all the bells and the whistles. And there are Class C office buildings that, like the ones in the second picture, which were typically built in the 20s or 30s, have smaller floor plates, maybe obsolete equipment, rickety elevators, and so forth. Now, if you're going to set up, if you've just gotten $100 million in venture capital to set up some kind of a slick new high tech company, you're going to want to go into Class A office space. You're not going to go into Class C office space just because it's cheaper or more available. On the other hand, if you're creating some kind of a funky product, you just might prefer the Class C office space because it's a lot funkier than the Class A, and so forth. So the point is, each market is different, and each user has a different idea of what they need. So given that, here are four basic market considerations. And these are things that I would say a lot of people who open businesses do not think through, which is why so many businesses fail. The first thing is, do people want what you're selling? Is there a market? If you're selling fur-lined paper, giant paper clips, you have to ask yourself, does anybody want a fur-lined giant paper clip? And then the second question, which follows, if only 3 people in the region want it, that's not enough to support a business. Do enough people want what you're selling to support a business in the location where you're proposing to put that business? Then, in most cases, you're not the only person in a city or a neighbor, even in a neighborhood sometimes, selling what you're selling. If you want to open a restaurant, for example, there may be 20 other restaurants within, say, a mile of the location you're thinking about. Can you compete with the other 20 restaurants? If you're going to offer basically the same stuff they do, but charge more, then odds are you'll be unsuccessful. If you open the first Burmese Thai fusion restaurant in the community, then you're offering something a little different and you might be more competitive. Or if you offer something, but you do it better or you do it cheaper or so forth, can compete with the others in your sector for what you're offering? And then the fourth one, and this again is kind of fundamental, but often overlooked. Do the people who want your product, assuming there are enough of them to support the product, do they have enough money to pay what it's going to cost you to provide the product? In other words, if you're going to offer the finest in French cuisine in an elaborate place with superb service and so forth, but you have to charge, say $150 for dinner or $200 for your dinner. Are there people who are going to come to your place who can afford to pay that kind of thing? Now, that's an extreme case. And clearly, those kind of restaurants don't exist outside of very specialized locations. And probably any given city can support maybe one or two of them. But more normally, if you're going to offer something that has a cost, will you be able to draw people who can pay for it? And this becomes a huge issue, again, when you're looking at urban neighborhoods where people do not have a whole lot of disposable income. So the ability of people to pay for whatever you're selling becomes a significant constraint. So before anybody opens a business or tries to support somebody else who's opening a business, so for example, if you're a CDC and you're trying to revitalize a commercial strip, and somebody comes to you with a proposition that they'd like to open a business in a particular location, you should walk through these questions with them. And now, nobody knows 100% for sure before you actually open the doors and see what happens. But if if the person proposing to open a business does not have a credible case for all four of these questions, then that particular business might just conceivably be considered too high risk to be worth investing in. You have to at least have a solid case for all four of these questions. Now, when we look at neighborhood commercial corridors, they have a lot of, there are some particularly challenging issues with them. Okay, the first, we have to remember the context. By and large, in most cities, especially in the East and the Midwest, maybe a little, somewhat less so out in the Southwest and West Coast, but still, even there, these corridors were created in a pre automobile era. They were places people walked to do their shopping or to get the services they needed, which is obviously something that has changed a lot. And as a result, they were designed to supply all of the neighborhood's needs. So there is a lot of commercial space on the typical neighborhood commercial corridor because, again, whether it was clothing, food, jewelry, luggage, you name it, people bought it there. There was only for special purchases that people would dress up and go downtown on the streetcar to the department store. Thirdly, a lot of these corridors emerged because of traditional ethnic neighborhoods. This is back in the 19th or early 20th century. And so they catered very much to that ethnic community. And the same, by the way, was true of the Black neighborhoods like Bronzeville in Chicago or Harlem. That again, these were strong commercial corridors built around the proposition that these corridors served a particular ethnic or racial group. So the stores were oriented to that ethnic or racial group as a distinct shopping market. Now, in Buffalo, for example, Broadway was known as Polonia, and it was probably the largest collection of Polish stores outside of Poland in the world. But all of these have changed. And being now, interestingly, in a lot of Latino neighborhoods and some Asian neighborhoods in cities today, you can see a kind of a recreation of the ethnic shopping center. And it'll be interesting to see if these survive or they go the way of the early 20th century ethnic shopping center. But most of these have changed. Another one is the properties don't necessarily work very well for a lot of the things people want to do nowadays. First, you have multiple scattered ownership. If you look at that picture, you see 5 properties there. I'm almost willing to bet that there are 5 separate owners involved. They have small footprints. They're narrow, they're long, they're dark. There's no parking. Now, in some cities, city governments have come and taken vacant lots and turned them into parking lots to help service the neighborhoods. But otherwise, parking is difficult. If you may have on-street parking in front of the stores, but that's very limited. And also, most of these do not have alleys. So when somebody gets the supplies, and I'm sure you've all seen this, all of a sudden you're on this busy, narrow, relatively narrow street, and a large truck shows up and blocks a traffic lane for half an hour while they unload. That's not good. So there are a lot of problems with these properties, just as properties, leaving aside the larger market issues. And then finally, a lot of these properties are in very poor condition. They require a lot of work to become a healthy, viable commercial operation. And you may have owners who have little or no interest in investing money in their properties. So there are a lot of major challenges involved with trying to revitalize a neighborhood commercial property. So taking a look at this, the next question then becomes, oh, just one illustration of this I'd like to make is 100 years ago, it's a pretty good bet that any halfway viable commercial corridor had a bakery and had real bakers in that bakery getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to come in and start baking the bread so it would be ready when the shoppers arrived. And generally speaking, it was pretty good bread, pastries, whatever. Today, outside of the most upscale neighborhoods, like the one which supports the bakery on the left there, the freestanding bakery in the United States has become, for all practical purposes, extinct. Why? Do people not like bread anymore? Good heavens, how can you not like bread? The reason is very simple. Virtually every substantial full service supermarket has a quote bakery unquote, where you can get a very wide variety of baked goods, pastries, and so forth. Now, they are not made from scratch in the store. What typically happens is either they're shipped in, period, like those stuffs in the plastic boxes in the front of the picture, or they come in as basically ready to pop in the oven loaves, which are then essentially cooked and served at the supermarket. But it's it's decent. It's not maybe not as good as the freshly baked stuff, but it is good enough, and it is generally cheaper. And again, most people, this is something to remember, most people in middle neighborhoods have cars. Most people in middle neighborhoods can get to a supermarket or a suburban shopping center without too much difficulty, within, say, 15 minutes to at most a half hour. So essentially, the supermarket bakery has driven the freestanding bakery completely out of business, except in the most upscale neighborhoods where you have people who are willing to spend substantial amounts of money for a really good loaf of bread or pastry. So the next question, looking at individual properties, you have to ask yourself, what does a particular space want to be? And there are, again, three questions. First, does it meet I missed this. Originally, I had three criteria, and then I added one, but I forgot to change this slide. What uses in this location might meet those four criteria? Given that, what is this space suitable for? If, for example, let's say hypothetically that that Burmese Thai fusion restaurant actually could be successful in this neighborhood. The question is this a space? Is this particular property you're looking at a space that would work for a Burmese Thai fusion restaurant, which, among other things, means the size of the space, the shape of the space, whether it has a kitchen and how much it would cost to put a kitchen in, and so forth. There are a lot of issues that come up. So that's the second question. And the third one is, assuming you do put it there, will it support itself? And this is a basic principle. Now, people can argue about this point. I believe that a business should be able to support itself. If it can't support itself on an ongoing operating basis, it's not a business. Maybe it's a social service. Maybe it's something else. It's not a business. However, I do believe that given the value of commercial corridors, the value of building up stronger neighborhoods and the commercial part, it is a reasonable use of public funds to provide possibly an upfront subsidy. So, for example, a number of special districts and other organizations provide funds to help a new business with the cost of the fit out, which can be very substantial. And if the owner has limited credit access, or if the cost of the fit out is unusually high, that can make the difference between that business then being able to support itself on an ongoing basis or going under because it has too much of a debt load. But I think it's very important, if you're going to have a viable commercial corridor, that you have businesses that can support themselves, albeit perhaps with some upfront subsidy. Now, some people might argue differently. Some people might say that it shouldn't be subsidized at all. If it can't make it, period, it shouldn't exist. Other people might say, well, what's wrong with subsidizing a business if it provides a useful service? Maybe, but then in my opinion, it's no longer a business at that point. So when you look at what it can be, though, there are a lot of different uses. And this is where you really have to start thinking. If the key purpose of a neighborhood commercial corridor is to be the heart of the neighborhood, and the actual business, in the sense of selling food or clothing or whatever, uses are secondary, then you should start thinking about non-business uses in the traditional sense, as well as business uses. Because the point is to create a street that is full of activity, that does not have vacant storefronts, does not have abandoned lots, does not have trash, and so forth. And businesses are not the only things that can make that possible. So here in a major site on a commercial corridor in North Philadelphia, they built a health center, a community health center. That's a very good use. I wish they'd done a little more with the facade, but that's a detail. It brings a lot of foot traffic. It looks good. It uses up space. It's an asset. There are a lot of those things that can be worth thinking about in addition to the business uses. A residential development is not a bad thing at all to put on a neighborhood commercial street, especially if you're looking to build, say, a multifamily use, like a 3 or 4 story apartment building, or supportive housing, or a senior citizen assisted living facility, or so forth. All of these can be very good complements to a neighborhood commercial corridor. A number of places, I've seen this in Philadelphia and Wilmington, other places, are developing small industrial facilities, including what are known as maker spaces. It is amazing, by the way. I could go into a whole rap about this, but I won't, about all the amazing things you can do with 3D printing and what are called CNC machines. But there's more and more opportunities for craft work, light industrial facilities, and so forth that are completely compatible with a neighborhood shopping street, and in fact can draw traffic as well. And then, of course, anything that one can think of, including obviously using vacant lots as parking or as small sitting areas and plazas and things of that sort. So the trick again is not to focus necessarily on the business uses, though to the extent that those can work, that's great. But to focus on how do you populate the corridor, and by which I mean both with buildings and uses and with people. Now, when we talk about populating a corridor, it's more than just buildings. And there are a series of issues. The first one, two things are essential. First is creating a critical mass of activity. Now, it doesn't have to be retail activity, though a certain amount of retail activity is important. But one way or another, you have to have a critical mass of activity. If you just have a couple of scattered stores here, they might survive, but they're not going to make the neighborhood corridor a healthy, viable, desirable place to be. The second is safety. If people do not feel safe, they're not going to come. Or if they come, they're not going to come back. So to me, those are the two essential features. Now, two things that are desirable but not essential, and this is something that may come, I think, as a bit of a shock to people who are into placemaking. Appearance and comfort are certainly desirable. Nice is always better than not so nice. But interestingly, they're not essential. One of the most viable, dynamic commercial corridors I know of in any urban neighborhood in the United States is a strip called in the neighborhood called Bangalatown in Detroit. It is basically a commercial strip that serves a neighborhood which is predominantly Bangladeshi immigrants with a significant admixture of Yemeni immigrants. And it is thriving. And I did a study of that neighborhood some years ago, and I actually went out there and counted well over 100 businesses that had been created in the past 5, 10 years along that one strip. It looks like hell. The buildings are cheap, tacky cinder block boxes. There are no trees. There's no aesthetic quality whatsoever to that strip. And it is booming. Now, from my sort of middle class city planning architecture background, would I like to see it prettier? Of course I would. Does it seem essential? No. The same is true. It's always nice to have an anchor establishment that draws a lot of people and then they sort of spread out and do other things in the neighborhood, like a supermarket or a department store or something like that. But again, it's not essential. And then finally, transit, open space, public art, these are all, in a generic sense, good things. But it's not clear what impact they actually would have on the viability of a neighborhood commercial corridor. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, because there's no evidence that they do any harm. And they may help, but it's very hard to predict the impact that they're likely to have on the neighborhood. Now, before tying this up, I'd like to switch gears for a second and talk just a little bit about a completely different challenge, which is struggling suburban shopping centers. And on the assumption that at least some of the people who are listening might be interested in or have these issues in their communities, it is worth mentioning. And basically, what's happened as shopping has evolved in this country since the end of World War II, and especially since the rise of online commerce, is we have a huge glut of suburban commercial space, which tends to appear in two distinct forms. One is what people typically call strip shopping centers. And you know exactly what I mean, I'm sure, not along interstate highways, but along the arterial roads that link the suburbs before the interstates came around. People starting in the late 40s and 50s built these strip shopping centers, and typically it's a row of stores with a big parking lot in front of it. Sometimes it's an L, sometimes it's just a row. These are A lot of these are struggling and sitting empty. And the second category are the enclosed malls that were overbuilt during the 70s through the 90s. And again, there are far more of them in this country than there is a demand for that space. And typically, what's happened in recent years is the ones that are in really strong market areas with large numbers of well to do shoppers continue to function. A lot of them have been reconfigured to look differently or work differently, but they continue as shopping malls basically. The ones in the less affluent areas have tended to decline, and many of them have actually been abandoned or converted to other uses. But it's interesting, even in some of the more upscale areas, there's a major trend going on with developers buying these places, demolishing the mall, and trying to rebuild them as something of a more mixed use residential plus commercial type of facility. But in the areas which have weaker retail markets, they have a lot of difficulty because clearly reusing, redeveloping a major shopping mall, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And people are not likely to invest that in areas with weak market conditions. So some of these have been converted into community serving facilities. You know, some of them have been taken over by mega churches. There are a variety of things, but a lot of them are still struggling and are still major problems for the neighborhood. So this is something that represents a big challenge in many neighborhoods. The strip shopping centers, if you can convince the municipality that handles the zoning to be reasonable, very often they make very good sites for multifamily housing because they're on major roads. You've got a lot of space. You can configure the housing. You know, you could build, certainly, it's a lot easier from a planning standpoint to justify doing maybe 4-story, 5-story, or even more housing along a major arterial road than in the middle of a neighborhood of smaller houses. So thinking about how to reuse these facilities is another part of the challenge and is very important, especially in organizations that are working on a regional or a suburban basis. So finally, one last point. This is the failure rate of small businesses in America is extraordinarily high. Now, a lot of these businesses that may have failed for all kinds of different reasons. Some of them were probably destined to fail from day one, sad to say, because people went in there. I remember, I'll just give one example. When I saw, this was in a city where I was working, somebody, and you can believe me, they probably took every penny of their savings and opened in a quite low income neighborhood shopping strip a store that specialized in making custom commemorative glasses and urns and plaques and so forth. So these are the kind of people who would take a large vase and etch on it Harry and Edna 50th wedding anniversary, July 1977 or something. Now, there was no chance. This was obviously somebody's dream. They had dreamed of opening such a store and they scraped and saved until they could do so. And within 6 months, it was out of business because it did not meet probably even the first test of the four market tests that I gave before. There weren't enough people who wanted it. They didn't want the people who might have wanted it did not want it in that location, and it certainly wasn't going to compete with people downtown offering the same product. And the people in the neighborhood, even if they wanted it, they didn't have the money to pay for it. So it was doomed. And to me, that store with these gorgeous etched glass commemorative vases and things in the window was just a symbol almost of how not to do it. So that's other businesses fail for all kinds of other reasons. A lot of people may have a great idea. I knew a guy, he's a lovely guy. He was a fabulous chef. He had a great catering business. He decided he wanted to open a downtown restaurant in a very competitive market. But he knew how to cook. He did not know how to run a large restaurant in a competitive environment in terms of such things as making sure that the dishes were not only tasty, but came out soon enough so that the customers weren't going to get upset, were still hot when they arrived at the table. He didn't know how to schmooze the customers and to build a clientele. He and he also spent too much to get the place up and running. It was a gorgeous place. He spent much too much, which meant he had too much of a debt load, and he failed. That business, in contrast to the guy with the etched glass vases, that business could have succeeded. But again, he didn't have the skills to the management skills. He had the cooking skills, but not the management skills. And he had too much debt. So that he had to make more money than he realistically could to both cover his operations and his debt load. So there are lots of reasons why businesses fail. And it's there, which means, again, it's important to be realistic and to be seriously critical, optimistic, because if you don't take chances, you'll never get anywhere. But you have to be realistic about what you're doing and about what the potential implications of what you're doing are. Commercial corridors can be revived. There are plenty of success stories around, but it's not easy. And there are also plenty of, shall we say, non-success stories around as well. And so if you go forward, I hope this has been useful, but in terms of really thinking through what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, and how to somehow overcome the challenges and take advantage of the opportunities. So with that, I see we have a lot of stuff in the chat. So I'm going to go open it up and let's see. Where do I start? Let's see. Okay.
Um, I'll toss one out that I think was kind of early on. I also wanted to acknowledge that Kim Lane is in the Zoom, and She works with the Pigtown Neighborhood Main Street organization, right, Kim? And I've always thought of that as a really exciting, compelling, successful Main Street program in Baltimore. So the question I wanted to pull out for you, Alan, is what do you think is a good balance of retail and social services in a Main Street?
Well, again, it depends on the main street, obviously, but I think I'm going to stop sharing so I can get organize this back. Okay, it I think you'd also want to look at. I would say it's not just those two. You look at residential. Getting residential is always a good thing to have on a main street, and but preferably high density residential. And one thing, by the way, about senior citizen housing is that senior citizens are less likely to want to drive places, and they're more likely to be a neighborhood market than many of the people who live in the houses on either sides of the commercial street. So the other thing, which is a really good use, I don't know if you'd call it social services, or you might, is facilities like a school or some kind of a performing arts facility if you know you can draw enough people to keep it going. You know, all of these, I shouldn't say all, most of these neighborhood strips once upon a time had movie theaters. Again, that's gone the way of most of the bakeries. But I think, if you could get half or a third to a half retail, and retail broadly defined to include, for example, professional services. So, for example, an accountant or a travel agency or things like that. I think that would be pretty respectable. If you could do more, obviously, so much the better. But I think realistically, aiming for a third to a half is probably a decent goal in most cases.
At the risk of mm, minimizing the importance, I don't want to do that in any way, but there are social services and there are social services, and one might, I'm thinking about what is your goal for the district overall, because it together, hanging together is an entity. And what happens in one space affects what happens in the other spaces. And so, for instance, I used to live in Ithaca, New York, and there is one commercial corridor on the annual help me the west side of downtown, I think, where the city's invested a lot of infrastructure money and all kinds of other economic development resources. And it is also one of the uses is a county social service um, building that got moved there. There's a lot of people who are there to get their methadone treatments. It's a different kind of, it attracts the social services that are there result in a lot of their customers are waiting around in the street, and that is sometimes incompatible with other uses that the business district is going for.
Yeah. I think that is a difficult, painful, but important point. Perceived safety is as important as actual safety. And people, when they're on a street, and this is particularly true of people, say, for example, who are senior citizens or may not feel comfortable in a potentially difficult environment, they look and see, they look at what they see, and they draw inferences from that. And it doesn't matter if somebody said, "Oh, no, 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 these people are completely harmless. They're actually quite nice people, and they would never bother you." It's all in how you perceive it, and you have to respect that. If you simply say, well, they're wrong or they're racist or they're anything like that, you're missing the point.
And I think there are probably many strategies to um, mitigate the downsides and elevate the upsides, and to be honest, in this particular district I'm talking about, I think the market is so strong that people in the end, are at a place of overlooking their discomfort. Let's see, what else do we have here?
Uh, yeah, that's the thing. If you're
Um,
yeah, a strong market, a
hmm,
strong market can overcome a lot of
so many things.
negative. If you're trying to build a market where it's been very weak and you're trying to build it, you don't have the same wriggle room.
Yeah. By the way, Elizabeth, if you're still in here, I I'm going to put you on notice that I'm hoping maybe we could call on you to say a little bit about the work that you did in Poughkeepsie on that business district, because I think you had to wrestle with all of these questions.
Yeah,
And while you're thinking about that, Elizabeth, I want to pose to Alan the question that Joe put in the chat for business sustainability. Do most of the stores, I assume he means retail stores that you see, also have an online presence so that they're not completely relying on foot traffic?
I think if you can build an online presence, that's definitely an asset. Now, that requires two things. One is either you've got to know how to create an attractive website with all the bells and whistles and so forth, or you've got to find a really bright teenager who does. That's sort of, and then, and you've got to keep it up to date. You've got to keep it up to date. You've got to keep it active, and so forth. Because the kiss of death is if you go to somebody's website and you can tell within moments that it hasn't been updated since 1923.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the second thing, of course, is you have to have a the ability to service an online market, which requires essentially you've got to be able to to get and manage a certain volume level. I don't know exactly what the amounts would have to be, but you're not going to, if you're just going to do one online sale every couple of weeks, it's not worth it to have all set up all the infrastructure to be able to do online sales. You've got to be able to do a certain amount of volume. And interestingly, that's why I think a lot of small businesses, which many of which have physical presences, but participate in something like Amazon Marketplace, even though Amazon takes a unconscionable share of their earnings, is to get the volume that they wouldn't be able to get if they just had their own freestanding,
Mhm.
operation, online operation. But so it's worth thinking very seriously about, but you've got to look at, again, be very realistically. Can you set up an attractive site that has everything you need? Can you maintain it so it's constantly current? And will it get you the volume that it will support it and justify maintaining it?
I've seen a couple of situations where um, that efforts were made in a way that really makes sense to me. And by that I mean Nidra Sims Fears in Greater Chatham has a significant commercial district with a lot of restaurants on it. And when COVID happened, uh, they nobody wanted to sit in a restaurant anymore, and everyone wanted to carry out and order online. And none, I don't think, of them had the capability of doing that. So she had created a very organized program to bring everybody's skills and capacity up on that issue and support people from where they were to a point of competence, as you say. Because in a commercial district, there might be one person who's really savvy with tech, and then three people who can't even stop writing paper checks, So it's really going to
I
be a
like.
mixed bag. I know, I know. I'm talking to you, Alan. No. And then the other thing I saw, I don't have the data to know how successful ultimately it was, but I'm very intrigued at the way she went about it. So Tracy Taft, who many of you may know from when she ran the Training Institute at NeighborWorks America, but then she popped up in this little tiny town in Arizona, in the middle of nowhere. And one of the things that she worked on there, I did an evaluation for, short-term evaluation, was collecting, trying to help artists in that community create an online presence. So because the trade area for their work locally was minuscule, so there's no way that, it was this whole strategy was to expand their trade area. And they chose to do it through Etsy, and they had a consultant come from Tucson to do a training series for people on, there's actually a lot to Etsy, and how to photograph their work, how to describe their work, how to get
Yeah.
serious about their work. And then they created a little business center for them so that they could share, you know, um, software that would otherwise be expensive. They could have a little fulfillment center and so forth.
But this really, really stresses a critical point, which I didn't actually mention, the importance of coordination and working together.
Mhm.
I mean, when it comes to a business, there are so many different moving parts, you might say. Certainly, that's what, in terms of online presence, is each individual business in a neighborhood shopping center, it may not be viable. For the commercial corridor as a whole, it might be, especially if the commercial corridor can create an online presence of its own, which of course means if they have some kind of a theme, some kind of a presence, some kind of identity, and then develop sort of co-op models for people to be able to participate in, whether with respect to online presence. For example, I know there's some wonderful maker spaces, as they call them, cropping up
Yes.
in a number of different neighborhood corridors, particularly because, you know, it's a place where you might be able to get a large building very inexpensively. And then you might have 30, 40, 50 different people in it, some full time, some part time, making things. Now, and again, creating a single site with a lot of visibility where each of them can have a part of the website and be able to market their stuff can be a huge advantage to them. Another thing, of course, has to do with providing support to the merchants at a basic level. So, for example, I mentioned the person who didn't who lost his restaurant because he couldn't manage it effectively, providing the support that people need to be able to know how to run their businesses more effectively. Support for how to make your store window look attractive, for example. How
Mm-hmm.
how to what you need, how to decorate your space, how to lay out your goods, all those sorts of things. Having people who can work with the storekeepers and the businesses and so forth to make that sort of thing happen, I think is really important. So having some kind of an organization that helps pull people together, as well as providing a vehicle for the individual merchants and shopkeepers, as well as neighborhood residents, to suggest things, complain, et cetera, is tremendously valuable. I'll just mention one because this is another important point of with neighborhood commercial is like in some of the illustrations in my slides, a lot of urban neighborhoods, commercial corridors, have ground floor retail and upper floors, which were originally, and in some cases still are, residential, or in some cases, office uses. And but in many cases are empty. Even in somewhat viable commercial corridors where most of the storefronts are occupied. A lot of the upper floors may still be empty. So figuring out how to fill up the upper floors is also an important part of the picture. And doing that with typically the most logical thing is residential. It's also often difficult because of things like fire restrictions and all kind of code issues, the cost of rehab, again, owners who are reluctant to invest, and so forth. But
Mhm.
but it's certainly an important part of the picture and should be in the mix. And I'm pleased to see that maybe bakeries are in fact on the rise. I certainly
Yeah,
hope
there's a lot in there.
I certainly hope so. And I think the point somebody made that a bakery in a neighborhood might be able to make a go of it if they act as a commercial bakery beyond
Hmm.
the immediate retail market is a very good idea and something that might be able to work in a lot of places.
Yeah, I think I've seen, many small business sort of support nonprofit try to create businesses with a built-in, say, laundry contract from a nearby hospital and stuff like that, so that they're interacting with a large ongoing anchor entity in the community. And I did also want to mention, I just learned that the Tompkins County Public Library in Ithaca, which happens to be located downtown and took over a very important business, Woolworths, that had been there forever. I mean, it was a property, it was really key to downtown's health. They relocated the county library there. It's quite a hub. And they now have a maker center that's really interesting and has all kinds of equipment. But we did manage to unmute Elizabeth.
Can I
Yes, go
just
ahead,
make
Al.
one point about just I see a question here from Bob Brown. And what do you do if the retail market is too weak to fill all the storefronts? How can one thing, by the way, and this is again where you need a coordinating body, like especially like a what is known as a SID or a BID or a Main Street group and so forth, which has maybe some resources or can get some from the city, is, for example, let's say there are businesses that might actually be able to make a go of it, but have very limited resources, very limited capital, and you don't and could not support a major capital investment. Suppose you went to the owners of these storefronts and say, in essence, you're getting nowheres. Tell you what, we will rent your building for a discounted rate for say 5 years. We'll put a commercial tenant in it for at a nominal rent to us. If they make it, they will stay in and pay you rent. If they don't, you know, you're no worse off than where you started. And start creating some, in some cases, you could call them pop ups, where you just have something for a very short term,
Yeah.
or something that's maybe a little more long term, but needs incubation to get going. Essentially, what you're
Mhm.
doing is trying to use the vacant storefronts as a kind of an incubator space to start up businesses and so forth, recognizing them that a lot of them will not make it beyond the 5 years or even that. But some of them might. And in the meantime, you're getting more activity and more visibility. And sometimes that's a good way to start a business. Now, I wouldn't say a bakery because there you're talking about a lot of specialized equipment, but start a
Mhm.
business that would not might not necessarily succeed from day one in that location, but given 5 years or so to build it, might actually have a shot. So just a
So we
thought.
got we were able to unmute Elizabeth Salaya, who now works at NeighborWorks America, but she used to run a place-based initiative in the Middle Main neighborhood in Poughkeepsie, and I observed her work there. It was really exciting and innovative. And Elizabeth, I wonder if you could say a little bit. You did type in some stuff in the chat, but about how you use social enterprises to kind of jumpstart the neighborhood, or perhaps it's still helping to sustain the neighborhood business community. And also, if you could speak about merchants associations, did you start one there or did you support one there?
Yeah, sure. Marcia, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, Alan and Marcia, this webinar has been fantastic, and I'm so grateful to both of you and to the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative for putting this together today. But yeah, I think the question around how do you do this work of combining business improvement and social services in a neighborhood is kind of what prompted the initial question, Marcia. And I think for
Mhm.
us, an ongoing solution has been a focus on utilizing social enterprises as one answer. Not certainly not the answer. The neighborhood is still facing many, many challenges and is still in a post-COVID recovery phase for sure. But we have been able to build a couple of different workforce training and entrepreneur training businesses as social enterprises that have really managed to continue a flow of engagement and activity in the neighborhood. So that includes a workforce training community arts center that takes in printmaking clients and
Mm.
teaches individuals in the neighborhood who have faced homelessness new skills and general workforce skills, as well as a shared use commercial kitchen, which serves as a food business incubator and which has been incredibly successful, even in a very, very difficult neighborhood, has had more than 150 businesses utilize the space for support over its 9 years of operation and has spun off some incredible, sustainable brick and mortar businesses and continues to have a waiting list that is more than 2 years long. And so I also want to posit that as one idea for folks to consider and look into. There's lots of examples of burgeoning food halls and kitchen incubators around the country that can serve as models. But we did find this to be a continuing success story. But this idea of thinking about creating a destination that is producing a product that is appealing, in this case, bakery, cafe, food, and art. So appealing to a demographic that might be willing to travel into that space as a destination. And in the process is training neighborhood residents and providing jobs and creating small businesses with the local community. That combination has real potential for impact.
Yeah.
What about a merchants association? Was there one when you started working?
Yes, we tried to create our own that we
Mhm.
were trying to steward as a nonprofit. It never managed to transition from nonprofit as the backbone to business run and led. That leap, I think many on the webinar know, is very difficult.
Yeah.
But just this year, the city of Poughkeepsie founded a business improvement district finally after about 30 years of trying. And so really excited to see where that may go as a more long-term solution.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. If I won't keep Elizabeth here anymore, but I also would if any of you want to talk about promoting business districts, she did some really cool stuff there. In fact, we should just do a whole different webinar about promoting commercial districts, probably.
Yeah. Just a couple of thoughts, some of the other stuff. So first, I think things like a commercial kitchen or a commercial bakery and using it also as a training opportunity are, again, can be a really attractive use for in a neighborhood commercial corridor, assuming, again, of course, that you've got the market for the product. The beauty of those, of course, is you're not relying on the neighborhood to be your market. So if you have a market in the city or even the sort of the region, you may be able to make a go of it. But they're certainly worth looking at. Another point, I see there has been some discussion of the penalty tax on vacant property. And the problem is it's it's a tricky proposition. I am ambivalent about those things. The first, to some extent, if you have a building in a strong market area let's say in a strong neighborhood in Washington, D.C., which does have a penalty tax on vacant property. If you have a building that's sitting vacant in that sort of area, given the strength of the market, I think it's a very good shot that you will, in fact, motivate the owner to get it rehabilitated or to sell it to somebody who will. In an environment where the market is not strong, it raises the serious possibility that the owner will then say, I've been paying on the taxes on this building for the last 10 years, even though I haven't made a penny. And now they're telling, and I don't have anything to do with this property and I can't think of anything. And now they're planning to double my taxes. The hell with it. I'm walking. Because all of a sudden, you've not just, if you don't have a realistic goal that they can be motivated to, you've motivated them to go in the opposite direction. So I think it's very problematic. I mean, the whole issue of whether you should have a land tax, just rather than a low tax on land and a higher tax on buildings, which Rick Rybeck mentions, is another interesting issue. And again, in a strong market environment, it can motivate people to use the property more productively, more effectively, and so forth. In a weak market environment, it may have the opposite effect.
Alan, can you say more about, because we've had more than one comment in here about owners who are maybe they're speculators who are buying multiple properties and sitting on them, or maybe they're just local owners who, I've experienced this myself, where at this point they're just using the building as storage for junk and they don't, or, it's not in code compliance right now and they'd have to get it in code compliance, et cetera. How do you deal with these owners of vacant property who don't want to do anything with it?
Threats mainly. No. Seriously, folks, ignore that comment. Now, this
Yes.
is one of the toughest issues is when you run across a situation where you don't have the ability to motivate the current owner to use the property in any kind of a constructive way. And the goal at that point becomes, how do I, as a city, as a nonprofit, get the property out of the hands of that owner and into somebody else's hands? In some cases, you may discover that the owner is willing to sell at a reasonable price, and then you buy it and do it. But the problem comes up in the situations where, especially if it's a speculator or if it's somebody who's unrealistic, and believe me, proper owners of real estate tend to be wildly unrealistic in terms of what they think their property may be worth, is what kind of tools might you have to compel them to sell? Because I think this is ultimately what it comes down to. And the question then comes up, I am not aware, though there might be a law, and typically the ground rules for what you can do to compel an owner to sell are at the state level, not at the local level. Cities, counties tend not to have the legal flexibility under state constitutions and the US Constitution to pass laws that deal with things like eminent domain and receivership and things like that. So you have to look at what the state allows, which varies, of course, enormously from state to state. Now, I know many states have laws that permit receivership for residential properties. Many states have where you can go to the court and ask the court to give you control of the property, and in some cases, actual title. New York State has a law that allows a municipality to go to court and ask for title for a property that has been abandoned for some length of time. And I don't know I don't recall offhand whether it applies only to residential or to any properties, but many states also have laws that allow receivership for vacant properties, where the receiver comes in, puts it back into productive use, and then typically either gets title or sells it to somebody else. I am not aware of laws, though there may be some, that allow receivership of commercial properties. And the main reason, of course, is that unlike a residential property where it may be a health and safety hazard to the tenants, it's rarely seen as a similar health and safety hazard. But the if it's vacant and meets the criteria of abandonment. So, for example, in the New Jersey law, if a property is vacant and has been vacant for 6 months, is not fully code compliant, meets and or is not paying taxes or is a nuisance, so forth. A municipality, there is a procedure whereby a municipality can use eminent domain to take that property. And there are a number of other states that have similar statutes.
Can you
So
give an example of somebody who has a commercial receivership law?
I don't know of any commercial receivership laws. I know some of the vacant property receivership laws do not distinguish between residential and commercial. So you could use them for commercial properties. But I'm not sure of any place that has specifically a commercial property receivership law. Similarly, some of the eminent domain laws that allow taking of vacant properties don't distinguish between commercial and residential.
Mhm. I bet this topic is exactly the sort of thing that probably has more than one session on it at the Vacant Properties Conference, right?
It would not surprise me because this is a tough issue. Eminent domain
Mhm.
has become the words eminent domain have become almost like a kind of a curse words in
Mhm.
many circles in the United States. And yet, if you care about the health and welfare of a community, there are properties that are going to continue to degrade that health and welfare unless they can be brought into somebody else's hands other than the current owner. We know that's
Sure.
the case.
Yeah.
Can't wish it away.
I wonder if do you think there are enough experts, because you would know them, they'd all be at Center for Community Progress, to do a webinar just on dealing with vacant commercial properties or not?
It's possible. I know there are a couple of people at Community Progress who are trying to work on some kind of a introductory guide book
Mm.
to dealing with commercial vacant properties. So I
Okay,
think
let's talk about that.
Yeah, Liz Koza might be a person to talk to about that.
Okay, that sounds really great. We're getting really close to the end of our time here, and we have a couple more slides to do. I think I'm going to, share with Alan everything that was in the chat so that if there are questions here that we didn't get to, he may choose to answer them offline, or we could put a little bit of a follow-up Q&A into the follow-up email we send to everyone that has the link to the recording and the slide deck. Okay, so Alan, thank you. People obviously really enjoyed this and could talk about this for much longer. Want to let you guys know that the last in the four-part series with Alan is coming up in August, on August 4th, and it's about the housing affordability crisis, who's affected and why it's happening. This will undoubtedly be a lively conversation, and I think he does come at it from a perspective that is not what you hear in mainstream media. So I think it'll be fun. Also want to let you know we're working on a CEU credit for APA session, Middle Neighborhoods for Planners, and also a session mapping the trends of middle neighborhoods in your community. We wanted to highlight for you a couple of professional development opportunities at the NeighborWorks Training Institute. The next one is in Miami in August. I'm going to be teaching my sort of neighborhood strategy course, High Impact Strategies for CCD in Places. It also happens to be one of 3 required courses for a micro credential. And designed a course that's being offered, Building Legacies, Property Inheritance and Estate Planning Strategies for Housing Professionals. So this is sort of all about how to incorporate estate planning, particularly around property inheritance, into your homebuyer education pre and post modules. Again, do not forget about this wonderful conference. There's the web address for registration, Reclaiming Vacant Properties 26 in Pittsburgh. I promise you'll love it. And we have a LinkedIn page. We would love it if you followed us there. It gives us a chance to know who you are and follow you back. And we want to let you know that by, email us with any ideas. You'll have a chance in a evaluation after this to list other ideas for webinars you'd like to see. Center for Community Progress also has a webinar series that's outstanding. It's called the Cornerstone Webinar Series. You might want to sign up from their mailing list. And finally, by joining us for this webinar, you'll be on our mailing list and you'll be a part of our community of practice. One of the things we offer to anyone for free is that we will customize a webinar about middle neighborhoods to your audience so that we can be of assistance to you in carrying forth some thoughts and raising awareness about middle neighborhoods for either your constituency or for your geography. We recently did one for the Urban Land Institute in New Mexico. So it was really taught from a developer's point of view. It was very interesting. And do we have a final slide? I think we do. Yes, just you're with us now. So thanks again, everyone, for participating. We love how lively this was. Thanks, Alan. We still have one more webinar with Alan next month. It's going to be a great one. And everyone have a great rest of your week. We'll talk to you soon.